a retired school janitor in Cape Breton, was disappearing. Not slowly, the way most people disappear from the world, all at once. His landlord had given him 60 days. His pension check covered rent or groceries, not both. He had a bad hip that the doctor said needed replacing and a waiting list that stretched 18 months into a future he wasn't sure he'd see. For 23 years, he had unlocked the doors of Glace Bay Elementary every morning before anyone else arrived. He had fixed the broken things nobody else noticed, and he had done one other thing, quietly, without telling a soul. Every winter for 23 years, he made sure no child at that school went hungry. Then one February morning, 67 of them showed up at his door. If you've ever been to Glace Bay on a January morning, you know what cold means. Not the polite cold of southern Ontario, the kind that gets into the walls of old houses and stays there until April. The kind that makes pipes groan at 3 in the morning and turns the walk from the parking lot to the front door into something you have to brace yourself for. Edgar Mouton knew that cold the way he knew the hallways of Glace Bay Elementary, by feel, by sound, by the way it changed things. He was 51 years old when he started at the school, recently widowed, recently relocated from Shetty Camp to live closer to his sister after his wife passed. He had worked construction most of his adult life, but his knees were going and the foreman told him straight. Another winter on a roof and he'd be done for good. The school board was hiring maintenance staff. He took the job because he needed one. He didn't expect to stay 23 years. He didn't expect a lot of things. The work was straightforward. Arrive before 7. Unlock the front doors, the gym, the supply closets. Check the boiler. Sweep the front steps if it had snowed overnight, which in Cape Breton meant sweeping the front steps roughly half the year. Keep the building running. Keep the building clean. Become invisible in the way that people who keep things running always become invisible. He was good at it, not because he needed the praise, but because he had learned from his father, a maintenance worker at a fish plant in Shetty Camp for 30 years, that if a thing was worth doing, it was worth doing like it mattered. Edgar learned the building the way you learn a person. Which radiator rattled in October? Which bathroom door needed a shoulder to open it properly? Which classroom windows leaked cold air when the wind came from the northeast? He fixed things before teachers had to ask. He was already gone by the time anyone noticed the problem was resolved. He learned the children the same way. Not their names at first, their shoes. A kid who came in with wet boots every Monday meant a family that didn't have a second pair to dry out over the weekend. A kid whose lunch bag was the same crumpled paper bag 3 weeks running, getting smaller every time, meant a kitchen that was running out of things to pack. A kid who lingered in the hallway after the bell because the hallway was warm, that kid was telling you something without saying a word. Edgar had grown up hungry, not starving, but the particular hunger of a family where the end of the month was a different country than the beginning, where his mother stretched a chicken into 5 dinners and called it cooking, and it was. It was extraordinary cooking, but they all knew what it meant. He knew what hungry looked like on a child. He had seen it in the mirror, so he started doing something about it. He didn't announce it, didn't go to the principal, didn't fill out a form, didn't start a program with a name on it. He just started keeping extra food in his supply closet on the 2nd floor. Nothing fancy. Crackers, peanut butter, apples, granola bars, the kind of food that could sit for a while and could be handed to a kid without making a production of it. If he saw a child sitting on the bench outside the office, looking small in the way hungry children look small, he'd walk by with a granola bar and set it down next to them the way you set down a tool you happen to be carrying. Casual, like it was nothing, because he understood what his own mother had once told him about receiving help. The worst part isn't needing it. The worst part is the moment when someone notices that you need it. That moment can shrink a person down to almost nothing. Edgar never let that moment happen. He never asked a child if they were hungry. He never made eye contact when he set the food down. He just kept walking. The message was, this is just something that happens here. You don't owe anything for it. In the winter months, he kept soup in a thermos. A big one, the kind built for a construction site, holding enough for 8 or 10 cups. He made it the night before, usually a simple vegetable soup because it was cheap, and it kept well. And he could make it with whatever was in the refrigerator. He set it up near the back entrance where the kids came in from the portables in the cold. On brutal mornings, he'd fill a cup and hand it to a child without breaking stride. "You look cold. Here. Drink this before you go in." No one counted how many children Edgar Mouton fed over those 23 years. Not the principal, not the school board, not the local paper that did a feature on the school's literacy program one spring without mentioning his name once. Edgar didn't count either. He just kept the thermos full. But here is what he didn't know. Every single one of those children remembered him. The first real sign that something was wrong came in late October, 2 years after Edgar retired. His neighbor, a woman named Paulette, who lived across the street and who had known Edgar since he moved to Glace Bay, noticed that his porch light hadn't been on in 3 days. Paulette was 72 and had developed the habit, over decades of living alone, of noticing the kinds of things other people stop seeing. She knocked. He opened the door. He looked like a man who had lost something and hadn't decided yet whether to go looking for it. The hip had gotten worse. He was moving around the apartment with one hand on the wall, the other gripping a cane he'd borrowed from his sister. He wasn't sleeping. The pain woke him up every few hours and kept him sitting in the kitchen in the dark because lying down made it worse. He had missed his last 2 follow-up appointments with the specialist because the clinic was 40 minutes away, and he'd given up his car the previous spring because insurance and maintenance had gotten too expensive on a fixed income. He told Paulette he was fine. She didn't believe him. She also noticed, though she didn't say so right away, that his refrigerator, visible from the kitchen doorway, was remarkably empty. Edgar Mouton had spent 23 years making sure other people had enough to eat, and he was going into winter with half a block of cheese, 3 eggs, and a jar of mustard. The pension was enough in theory. In practice, the landlord had raised the rent twice in 18 months, the last time by an amount that would have been reasonable in Halifax and was completely disconnected from reality in Glace Bay. Edgar had paid it, each time, by adjusting other things. The car went first, then the phone plan, down to the cheapest option. Then groceries, not all at once, but in the gradual way that people reduce things when they're hoping the situation will turn around before they have to admit what they're doing. He didn't tell anyone. He was 67 years old and he had lived his entire life as the person who handled things. The person who showed up before anyone else. The person who fixed what was broken and handed children granola bars and soup without making them feel small for needing it. He did not know how to be on the other side of that. There was also the letter. It had come 3 weeks earlier, official paper, property management company, letterhead. The building had been purchased by a numbered corporation out of Halifax. The new owners were converting the upper floors to short-term rentals. Tenants would be given 60 days. Edgar's apartment was on the 3rd floor. He had lived there for 11 years. He read the letter twice, folded it along its original creases, put it on the kitchen table. Then he went and sat in his chair by the window and watched the street for a while. He had nowhere particular to go. His sister lived in a 2-bedroom with her husband and their adult son, no space. He'd looked into senior housing. The wait list was 14 months for subsidized units. He'd done the math on a room in a shared house and the math didn't work. 60 days. Bad hip. Empty refrigerator. And nobody who knew any of it. The woman who saved his life didn't know she was about to do it. Her name was Simone Chiasson Roy, and she was 34 years old and working as a licensed practical nurse at the Cape Breton Regional Hospital when she drove past Glace Bay Elementary for the first time in nearly a decade. She was taking a new route to avoid construction on the main road. She turned onto the street where the school sat, and something happened that she would later struggle to describe, except to say that she felt it before she understood it. A physical response. A tightening in her chest, not pain, more like recognition. She had been 9 years old when her parents' marriage fell apart. Her father left. Her mother, who had been working part-time at a laundromat, suddenly had 3 children to feed on a schedule that no longer made sense. There were months, Simone didn't count them, but she could feel them still, when she went to school hungry and stayed that way until the next morning. Not every day. Enough days. She was in grade 4 when she first found a granola bar sitting next to her on the bench outside the principal's office, where she'd been sent for falling asleep in class. She wasn't even sure where it came from. There was no one around, just the bar and a cup of water and the quiet hallway. She ate it so fast she barely tasted it. It kept happening. Small things. A bag of crackers left on her desk after lunch on a day her lunch bag was empty. A cup of soup pressed into her hands on a February morning so cold the air felt like it had edges. Always wordless. Always timed so that nobody was watching. Always somehow knowing. She was 12 before she figured out it was the janitor. She'd caught a glimpse of him rounding the corner just after finding a cheese sandwich wrapped in foil in her coat pocket during a field trip. She'd looked up and seen his back disappearing through a door, and she had known. She never said anything to him. She was 12, and she didn't have the words, and she wasn't sure she could have said them without crying, which she was not going to do, not at school. She went to university on a combination of student loans and a bursary from a Cape Breton community foundation for students from low-income households. She became a nurse because somewhere along the way, in the years of figuring out who she wanted to be, she kept coming back to the same idea. She wanted to be the person who noticed, the one who saw what wasn't being said and did something about it without making a production of it. She thought about the janitor more than she expected to over the years, not obsessively. But sometimes, in a quiet moment at the hospital, handing a frightened patient a warm blanket or staying past the end of a shift to sit with someone who had no family in the building, she would think, "This is what he taught me. You don't have to make it a big thing. You just have to do it." She did not know his name. It sounds strange. She had thought about him for 20 years, and she didn't know his name. But that was exactly what he'd done. He had helped her in a way that never required him to introduce himself, and so he'd stayed, in her memory, as simply the man who saw her, the janitor, the one who kept the thermos full. She drove past the school that morning and pulled over. She sat in her car for a moment, then she took out her phone and searched. Glace Bay Elementary School janitor retired. The third result was a short article in the Cape Breton Post from 2 years earlier. A small piece, barely 3 paragraphs, about long-serving school employees retiring that June. His name was in the second paragraph, Edgar Mouton, 23 years of service, no photograph, no quotes from him. A quote from the vice principal saying the school would miss his reliability. Simone read the article twice. Then she started trying to find him. She asked at the school. She found a retired teacher, now volunteering at the school's library, who had overlapping years with Edgar, and who said she thought he still lived somewhere in Glace Bay. She'd heard he wasn't doing great. She'd heard something about a hip. Simone tracked down his address through a former colleague of Edgar's who was still in touch with him occasionally. She called. The number was disconnected. She drove to the address. Paulette answered the door before Simone could knock twice. She was, it turned out, ready to talk to someone about Edgar. The 2 women stood in Paulette's hallway for 20 minutes. Paulette told Simone about the letter, the hip, the empty refrigerator, the appointments he'd stopped keeping. She said she'd been worried for weeks, but she didn't want to push because Edgar was a proud man who would shut down if he felt like he was being managed. Simone listened. Then she went across the street. Edgar opened the door. He looked at her for a moment, the way you look at someone you know you should recognize but can't quite place. She said, "Mr. Mouton, my name is Simone. I went to Glace Bay Elementary a long time ago. I think you used to leave food for me when I was a kid. I'm a nurse now, and I think you might need some help." He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "You'd better come in." He didn't remember her specifically. He said so right away, and Simone said that was fine. She hadn't expected him to. She told him what she did remember, The granola bar outside the principal's office. The cheese sandwich in her coat pocket on the field trip. The soup on cold mornings handed over without eye contact, without a word that might have made her feel small. Edgar listened. His hands were folded in his lap. He didn't speak. When she finished, he said, very quietly, "I didn't think any of them noticed where it came from." She told him that she had noticed, that she'd known it was him since she was 12, that she'd thought about it for 20 years. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I just didn't want them to go through the morning with nothing in them. That's all it was. That's all it was." Simone looked at this man, 67 years old, sitting in an apartment with a broken hip and an eviction notice on the kitchen table and almost nothing in the refrigerator, and she thought about what he had said, and she thought about the granola bar she'd eaten so fast she'd barely tasted it, and she thought about every warm cup of soup on every cold morning, and she understood something she hadn't had the words for at 12. It was never just food. It was the decision to see someone, to act on it quietly without requiring anything back. Not thanks, not the right response. Just, "I see that you need this, so here it is." She left after an hour. She told him she'd be back. That night, Simone posted in the Cape Breton community board on Facebook. She kept it short. She said there was a retired school janitor in Glace Bay who had quietly fed hungry children at Glace Bay Elementary for over 20 years. He was facing eviction and health problems and he needed help. She wrote, "If he ever gave you something when you had nothing, please reach out." She didn't use his name right away. She thought some people might not know it. She described him instead, the man with the thermos in February, the one who left food without saying a word. The first comment came in 8 minutes. Then 17 more in the next hour. By midnight, the thread was running long enough that Simone had to scroll to keep up with it. "He gave me soup every single day in grade 6. I was going through the worst year of my life, and that soup was sometimes the only warm thing in my day. My son is 11 now and healthy, and I have never forgotten that man. I remember him. I moved to Alberta in 2009. I still think about the day I found crackers in my desk, after I hadn't eaten since the day before. I never knew who put them there, but I knew. I'm coming home for Christmas next month. How do I help? He fixed the radiator in my classroom every single October without being asked. But the food thing, yes. I taught there for 14 years. I knew something was happening. I could never figure out how he always knew which kids to watch for. He just knew. My daughter went to that school. She told me once about a man who used to give her hot chocolate from a thermos on winter mornings. She's 26 now. She's finishing her master's degree. She said he was the first adult outside our family who ever made her feel like she mattered. She said she wanted to thank him someday. I'd like to help make that happen. That last message came from a woman named Colette Fournier Bates, who lived in Sydney Mines and whose daughter, Marguerite, was doing graduate work in Halifax. Simone replied immediately. By the time they spoke on the phone 30 minutes later, it was past 11 o'clock, and neither of them mentioned the hour. Over the next 10 days, Simone organized. She was not a person who used the word community lightly, having grown up in the version of it where community means the people who help you when the system doesn't, not an abstraction. She made a list. She called people. She sent messages from the hospital break room between shifts. She spoke to a social worker she knew through the hospital, who had connections to housing advocacy organizations in Cape Breton. She spoke to a retired teacher named Gloria Rankin, who had worked at the school for 16 years alongside Edgar and who, upon hearing what was happening, said, "I always suspected he was doing something like that. He was that kind of person. What do you need from me?" The responses kept coming. A man named Antoine Beaumont Craig wrote that he had grown up 2 blocks from the school, had eaten lunch in the hallway outside the supply closet more times than he could count, because Edgar had quietly established an unofficial open-door policy. Nobody was ever told about it explicitly, but the kids who needed to know, knew. Antoine now ran a small contracting company in New Waterford. He wrote, "I can fix the hip problem. I can't fix it, but I know people, and I can drive him to his appointments." Someone should be driving him to his appointments. Antoine's message arrived on a Thursday. By Friday, he had already contacted a patient navigator at the hospital, a role Simone had told him existed. Someone whose job was to help patients without strong support systems get through the healthcare maze. He'd set up a call for Edgar on Monday. A retired nurse in Antigonish named Bernadette Ouellet Marsh wrote that she had done her placement at a Glace Bay clinic 30 years ago and had heard, through a colleague, about a school janitor who apparently kept a running mental inventory of which kids seemed underfed and responded accordingly, and that she had admired it then without knowing his name and would like to help now. A woman in Halifax named Sandra wrote that she'd grown up in Glace Bay and her sister had gone to the school in the 90s and their mother had struggled for years, and she thought her sister might have been one of the children. Edgar helped, but her sister had passed away, cancer, 4 years ago, and she wanted to contribute in her memory. 67 people confirmed. 67 people who had been fed, or whose children had been fed, or whose siblings or friends or students had been fed by a retired janitor who had done it without asking for anything, without telling anyone, without a single moment of visible credit in 23 years. They set a date, a Saturday afternoon in late November. They made a plan. Edgar had no idea. On the Friday before, Edgar Mouton sat in his kitchen and read the eviction notice again. Not because he hadn't already read it 6 times. Sometimes you read something again hoping it will have changed. It hadn't changed. He looked at the cast iron skillet hanging on the wall. His wife Margot had bought it at a flea market in Inverness the summer they got married. $39, she'd said. Proud as anything. Worth 10 times that for what we'll make in it. He had made more meals than he could count in that skillet. After she died, he'd almost left it behind when he moved to Glace Bay. He couldn't explain now why he hadn't. He was glad he hadn't. He thought about the school, about the children, about the years of mornings, the thermos of soup, the granola bars, the small careful business of making sure nobody started the day with nothing. He wondered, as he sometimes did, if any of it had mattered. Not in a self-pitying way, more the way you wonder sometimes about things you can't verify. You do a thing for 20 years in the dark and you hope it was worth it, but you have no way to know. There was a knock at the door. He assumed it was Paulette. He opened the door and Simone Chasson-Roy was standing in the hallway, and behind her the hallway was full. People, many of them, filling the corridor and the stairwell, voices coming up from the floors below. Some of them carried children. Some of them were older, people who had been kids at the school in the 90s and were parents now. Some of them were teachers he half recognized. Some of them were complete strangers who had heard the story from someone else and had come anyway. Edgar looked at them. He had spent 23 years being invisible. He had made a practice of it, had built it into the way he moved through the world. The janitor. The one with the thermos, present enough to help, absent enough to make the help feel like something that had simply appeared. He did not know what to do with 67 people standing in his hallway. Simone spoke first. She said, "Mr. Mouton, you don't remember most of us, but we remember you, and we need you to let us help you." A man stepped forward from the group. It was Antoine, broad-shouldered, still in his work jacket, holding his hard hat in his hands. He said, "You used to leave a thermos of soup at the back door by the portables. Grade 5, every morning that winter. I don't know if you knew which kid it was for, or if it was for all of us, but it was there and I drank it every day and I didn't freeze. I've been in construction for 15 years. I'm good at fixing things. I'd like to fix some things for you, if you'll let me." A woman behind him said, "You left crackers in my desk once after I'd spent my lunch hour pretending I wasn't hungry. I'm a teacher now. I try to do what you did. I'm not as good at it, but I try." Another voice, "You fix the heater in our classroom every October. We all knew why you kept checking it. Our classroom had 3 kids from the same family. Their coats weren't warm enough. You kept that room 2 degrees warmer than anywhere else in the building. I don't know how you knew. I don't know how you managed it without anyone noticing. But we noticed." The voices came one after another, not organized, not rehearsed, just accumulated. Years of small things that had never been said out loud until this hallway, this Saturday in November, this man's standing at his door with his hand on the frame, because his hip was bad and he needed the support. Marguerite Fournier was there. Colette's daughter, the one finishing her master's degree, who had said he was the first adult outside her family, who made her feel like she mattered. She was 26, wearing a good coat, and the kind of careful composure that meant she was holding something together by concentration alone. She looked at Edgar and said, with the directness of a person who has practiced what she needs to say, "I have a scholarship. I have a career path I believe in. I have a life that is going the way I want it to go. You're part of how that happened. I know that sounds like too much to put on a cup of hot chocolate on a cold morning. But it's true. So I wanted to say it to your face." Edgar had not cried in a long time. He was not a man who cried easily, had not been, not even when Margot died. He had cried then alone in the house in Cheticamp the night after the funeral, and that had been enough, he thought, to last him a while. He was wrong about that. He sat down in the doorway. Not fell, sat, deliberately, the way a man sits when he decides he cannot keep standing, and he put his face in his hands, and the people in his hallway let him. Simone sat beside him on the floor. She didn't say anything. She just stayed there, the way a good nurse stays with a patient, fully present, not requiring anything from them, which was, he would later realize, exactly what he had done for her when she was 9 years old on a bench outside the principal's office. After a while, he lifted his head. He looked at the faces, 67 people, in his hallway on his staircase, spilling out onto the landing below. Children and grandchildren, and former students, and former colleagues and strangers who had heard the story from someone, who had heard it from someone else. All of them carrying the same thing. The specific weight of a kindness they had never been able to return until now. He said, "I didn't think anyone was paying attention." Simone said, "You made sure we weren't. That was the whole point." "But we were. They did not come only with words." Simone pulled out her phone and showed him a screen, a fundraising page set up 4 days earlier, his name at the top. A photograph someone had found, him standing in front of the school on his last day, squinting slightly against the June sun, holding a coffee cup, smiling in the way people smile when they're not sure a photograph is being taken. The number on the screen was $41,000. Edgar looked at it for a long time. He said, "That's not right. That can't be right." Simone said, "It's been running for 4 days. The local radio picked it up on Thursday morning. It's still going." He shook his head. He said, "I can't take this. I didn't do it for this. I was just trying to keep the kids from being cold and hungry. That's all it was." Antoine said, from somewhere in the hallway, "Mr. Mouton, you spent 23 years making sure people could accept help without feeling small about it. Would you mind letting us try to do the same for you?" Edgar looked at him. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Your mother was Claudette. She worked at the Tim Hortons on Commercial Street. You used to come to school with your coat buttoned wrong because you were dressing yourself in the dark so you wouldn't wake her after a night shift." Antoine went very still. Edgar said, "I remember the kids. I might not have names for all of them, but I remember the kids." Antoine said, and his voice had changed completely. "Then you know which one I was." Edgar said, "I know which one you were." The hallway was quiet. Then Antoine said, quietly, "So let us help you, please." The fundraising money covered the things that needed covering. The specialty consultation that had been sitting on a waiting list was fast-tracked through a connection Bernadette had in Antigonish, a surgeon who owed her a favor from years back, and who, when she explained the situation, said she didn't need to call in any favor, she'd fit him in. The hip replacement was scheduled for March. The housing situation took more work. Antoine and 2 men from his crew spent a weekend doing a thorough assessment of the building situation. They connected with a tenant rights organization in Sydney that took on Edgar's case and found, in the conversion documents, a procedural error that gave Edgar significantly more time than 60 days and potentially grounds for a longer-term remedy. The fight wasn't over, but it wasn't as simple as the letter had made it sound. A retired social worker in the group, a woman named Henriette Vaugeois, who had spent 30 years navigating provincial housing systems, began working through the application process for a proper subsidized unit with documentation that she helped Edgar pull together on 2 successive Saturday afternoons at his kitchen table. She did not find the process fast or simple. She found it exactly as obstructive as she expected it to be. And she had been managing those obstructions for 30 years, and she was very good at it. 3 women from the group organized a rotating weekly grocery run. Not a charity delivery, a roster. One week, Antoine's wife, the next week, Marguerite when she was in town, the next week, a woman named Jocelyn, who had been in grade 3 at the school in 1998, and who, when asked if she was sure she had time, said she drove past the co-op on Tuesdays anyway, and it was no trouble. Edgar let them do it. This was, everyone who knew him agreed, the most remarkable thing of all. A man who had spent his entire adult life on the giving end of things, sitting down to let himself be given to. He wasn't graceful about it at first. He said thank you too many times. He offered to pay for things he didn't have money to pay for. He apologized for inconveniences that weren't inconveniences. But slowly, over the weeks that followed, something eased in him. He started leaving his door unlocked in the evenings. Paulette started coming over on Wednesday nights, and they watched the hockey game together, her on the couch and him in his chair, and she brought a casserole because she made one anyway for herself every Wednesday, and it was just as easy to make a bigger one. He started answering the phone again. He started making coffee in the morning with the intention of sharing it, because Antoine had developed the habit of dropping by on his way to a job site, not every day, but enough days. He was not alone anymore. He was something he had not been since Margot died, not just not alone, but specifically accompanied. Known. The people who showed up in his hallway that November afternoon had not simply helped him. They had decided that he was their business. The way he had once decided that the cold and hungry children of Glace Bay were his. The hip surgery happened on a Thursday in March. Simone was working that day, not on his ward, but she checked in at the start of her shift and at the end. Antoine drove him to the hospital and sat in the waiting room for 4.5 hours, reading a home renovation magazine from 2019, because he said he had nowhere else to be, which wasn't true. And they both knew it wasn't true, and neither of them mentioned it. Edgar woke up in the recovery room with the skillet sitting on the windowsill. Simone had arranged it. She'd called Antoine 2 days before the surgery and told him to bring it. She'd spoken to the nursing staff and gotten permission to have it in the room. Just so he sees something familiar when he wakes up, she said. Something from home. He lay there for a while after he woke up, looking at it. The black iron. The handle worn to a shine from 30 years of use. Margot's skillet bought at a flea market in Inverness for $39 and worth, she'd said, 10 times that. His eyes filled. He had spent 23 years helping children begin their mornings with something warm in them, because he knew from his own childhood what it meant to start the day with nothing. He had done it in the dark on purpose, without names or records or acknowledgement. He had let it be invisible because that was the only way to make it safe. He had not expected anyone to find him. He reached out and touched the handle of the skillet. Cold metal, real, solid, the object that connected him back through every meal he'd ever made, back to Margot standing in a flea market parking lot holding it up and saying, $39, Edgar, look at that, he thought. I kept cooking. I kept the thermos full, and they came back. Somehow, all these years later, they came back. 6 months after the surgery, Edgar Mouton stood in a school gymnasium in Glace Bay. Not Glace Bay Elementary. The school had changed shape, the way all things change shape eventually. A wing had been added, a principal had retired, the portables at the back had been replaced with a proper addition. But the building was still there, and it was still full of children. And someone, at some point in those 23 years, had paid attention to more than Edgar knew. The vice principal who had written the retirement article, the 3-paragraph one with no photograph, had felt quietly bad about it for 2 years. When the fundraiser story made it to the radio, she'd called the current principal. The current principal called the school board communications office. These conversations led, with the specific slowness of institutional decision-making, to this gymnasium, this evening, in September. There was a small ceremony, not large. The gymnasium was full but not packed. Former students and teachers and neighbors and the 67 people who had been in his hallway and some who hadn't but had heard the story and wanted to be there. A school board representative made a brief speech that was decent but slightly too long. A retired teacher named Gloria Rankin told a story about the winter the boiler kept breaking down, and Edgar had fixed it 6 times in 2 months without ever suggesting it might be beyond fixing, because the children needed the building to be warm, and that was that. Then they unveiled a small plaque. It was mounted in the main hallway, near the back entrance, where the portables used to be. Near the door where Edgar had stood for 23 winters, handing cups of soup to children who were cold. It said, "In recognition of Edgar Mouton, maintenance staff 1992 to 2015, who kept this building warm and made sure nobody started the day with nothing. Seen, finally, by the people he saw first." Edgar stood in front of it for a long time. Then Marguerite Fournier appeared beside him. She was holding a small child, her sister's, on her hip. The child was 3 years old and had no idea where she was or why there were so many people, only that it seemed important and that the man everyone was looking at had a very kind face. Marguerite said, "My mum wanted to be here. She passed in January, but she knew this was coming. She knew because I told her, and she said to tell you. The hot chocolate was the best thing that happened to her that whole winter. She never forgot it." Edgar looked at Marguerite. He looked at the child on her hip. He said, "What's her name?" Marguerite smiled. She said, "We call her Maggie. Her full name is Margaret." Edgar nodded. He reached out, and the child, who had been watching him with the focused curiosity of a 3-year-old conducting a very serious evaluation, reached back and wrapped her small hand around his finger. He stood there in the hallway of a school in Glace Bay, with a child's hand around his finger. And he understood something he had been working toward his whole life without knowing it had a destination. You don't feed people because you expect them to come back. You feed them because they're hungry and you can, and it's the right thing to do in that moment, in that cold, on that morning. That's the whole reason. That's enough. But sometimes, if you're very lucky, they come back anyway. He had spent 23 years handing out warmth in a cold building, and it had come back to him, finally, in this hallway. In 67 people standing in his corridor. In a child named Maggie holding his finger like she intended to hold on for a while. The skillet still hung on his wall. The hip was healing. Paulette still came on Wednesdays. Antoine still stopped by on his way to job sites, not every day, enough days. And that winter, for the first time in years, Edgar Mouton went into February with a full refrigerator and people who would notice if his porch light went out. That's what it looks like when a life comes back to someone. Not all at once. Quietly, in the specific way that kindness travels. Slowly, through people who carry it forward without knowing where it will end up. It ends up, sometimes, exactly where it started.